So straight back in, the driving tech. What is driving tech companies today? Flow economics is the grand title. We can debate the application of that in the specifics that we have to discuss this morning, which are obviously, given our guests, the realm of technology and the realm of Preston McAfee. McAfee. Have I pronounced it right? McAfee. Chief Economist and Vice President Microsoft. Michael Schwarz, next to him, Chief Scientist for Waze, Google. And Pai-Ling, Associate Professor of Clinical Entrepreneurship and Director, Technology Commercialization Initiative. It's a long one, isn't it?
I know.
At USC.
Academics are always long-winded.
Okay, yeah. The best ones always are. Okay, so how tech companies are recruiting and mobilizing economists for smart business design. I think we'll just narrow it to smart business design. Preston.
Thank you. It's a very great honor and pleasure to be here. I want to start by talking a bit about a technology called market design. And market design is economics practiced as an engineering discipline. So it bears the relationship to traditional economics that engineering bears to physics. And you've probably, most of, actually just do a show of hands, how many of you have heard of market design? More than, that's more than in years past. $200 billion has gone through market design technologies. 100 billion in the spectrum auctions alone. About 100 billion worth of physicians have been placed in medical residencies using market design. Al Roth won a Nobel Prize for that work. So this is it's a technology that's been around since the early 1980s. It's an accepted technology, and yet it's almost unheard of. And the reason I want to bring it up is, well, first let me say what it is. It's how do we improve markets? So you hear often conservatives say markets are magic, just leave it to the market, it'll all work out. Others on the more liberal end say no, we need to run it by the government. Market design lives somewhere in between. It says we don't always get the outcomes that we want out of markets. Let's tweak the markets and yet still harness market forces. And the reason I want to bring this up is traditionally the way you did market design is you hired a brilliant person who did a handcrafted market design. This is about to change, and it's about to change because of big data. The sensors, data, machine learning allow an entirely new take on market design, the automation of market design. We're seeing the first glimmers of this with companies like Uber and Airbnb. Those are companies who have hired market designers to help make their markets work better because they are in the business of markets. And we just saw in the previous talk, the guys who run networks, markets are always networks, right? You're connecting buyers and sellers. Those guys are much more valuable. Market design helps make them even more valuable and realize their potential. So I think we're on the verge of a revolutionary period in market design where we start seeing basically machine-run, machine-led, data-driven market design. Now I want to pivot this slightly and then leave a little bit of time for everyone else and say, one of the things that I find myself explaining over and over again is that it doesn't matter how much data you have if you don't have ground truth. If I want to predict health outcomes, I need a population of people whose health outcomes I already know. I can have all the data in the world about blood pressure and so on, but if I don't actually have the dependent variable, the outcome variables, and with reasonable precision, all of that data is going to be useless. And a big gap today is we're collecting lots and lots of data, but we tend to have really small data that's trustworthy about outcomes. And that's, I think, where the really big value going forward is. And let me just take a breath there and cede the mic back to Ed.
Okay, Michael, I mean, am I right in saying that you are applying some of these data concepts in the way that you have developed, well, specifically Waze Google? I mean, is that something?
Absolutely.
Explain that to us, and how is it working in a practical context?
Sure. So let me kind of give a somewhat both smaller and bigger picture here. What market designers do. So first of all, it's very unusual to see more than one market designer at the same time. There are very, very few of us, and there are very few. There are quite a few markets out there, but usually a market needs only one market designer, sometimes zero, so you see two at the same time. First of all, what do market designers do, right? So Preston gave you kind of a big picture. So let me give you a little bit of a small picture. So most people don't realize what market design is. They think it's marketing, right? So of course, you know it's not. So let me start out. It's not directly an answer to your question, but to some extent it is. Let me start out with why do you even need market design? Or why do we need this engineering discipline? Why are people winning Nobel Prizes for market design? People were doing markets for thousands of years. And the answer is, well, once you start allocating things and deciding on prices, you face a lot of choices. What price do you set? Whom do you allocate a particular object? And here you have complicated algorithms. And a lot of times those algorithms are not very complicated. Sometimes they are. So let me give you first an example of a market that Preston mentioned, the market for medical residents. So there's a beautiful mathematical theory and a beautiful algorithm for allocating those residents to residency slots. And in fact, it was developed by Gale and Shapley, and later Shapley was awarded Nobel Prize in part for that work. So here's a shocker. In fact, the algorithm for allocating it, in fact, was not discovered by Shapley, even though it's a classical paper, even though Shapley thought he discovered it. In fact, it was discovered by practitioners years earlier. And they didn't know they discovered some general principle. They were just hacking around, and they saw that the market wasn't working. And then they would do another hack. And eventually, they came up with something that mathematically isomorphic with that algorithm. So there you had like basically an amateur, an anesthesiologist, who created that very hacky algorithm that turned out to have beautiful, very simple mathematical representation. So that anesthesiologist had no idea how to apply it in different domains. And he didn't know he discovered something. He just knew that for years it didn't work, and then it did. And that's kind of the beauty of market design. You have those principles that you can apply all over the place. And well, that's what market designers do. And that's why market design is very important for new markets.
Okay, so I mean, are there specific ways? Give us a very concrete, simple example of a new application of market design. Obviously, we're familiar with some of the very classic Silicon Valley kind of archetypes that we've seen in recent years, the Ubers and the Airbnbs. But I mean, are there other more modern, specific examples you can talk to us about?
A specific example that kind of strikes close to home would be auctions for sponsored search advertisements. So, of course, by now they're not new, but...
This was the Google Ads kind of thing going back a few years, right?
Sure. Well, it's more than a few years,
Yeah.
but sponsored search market is by now more than almost 15 years old.
Yeah.
It was new 15 years ago, so I couldn't talk about things that are very, very new for obvious reasons.
Okay.
So let's go back about 15 years. So there you had a market where, well, there were keywords. There was a company called Overture that later was acquired by Yahoo, and they invented keyword marketplaces. So how would you sell a keyword? So at first they thought, oh, well, it's very simple. Advertiser would offer some price, and we'll show ads in order of bids, and it's all simple. And it sounds simple enough. It makes sense, right? It's sensible. Well, they weren't market designers. So it turns out that it's not very sensible. Let's say I'm bidding $2 for this keyword, and someone else bids $1, and someone else bids 50 cents. So then I'm getting the first slot, I'm paying $1, the guy below me pays 50 cents. So then I quickly realize I should be bidding 51 cents instead of $1. Because why pay $1 when I could get away with 51 cents? Well, the guy below me, he says, well, why, if the guy above me pays 51 cents, I'm paying 50 cents, maybe I should pay 51 cents. So it becomes very unstable. It's not a good design. So that's an example, why you need market design, because they created an unstable system where algorithm needed to be changed to make it simple.
Okay, let's, Pai-Ling, now we've already touched on data, which is of course where we're at now, right? Big data, how all this huge influx of data is going to affect future decisions, future ideas around market design, whatever it might be. You are looking very specifically at apps, and you think this is the gold mine right now, the potential gold rush. Tell us more.
My research actually studies mobile apps, and I think that in connecting to what Michael just said about, there are these practitioners who go out into the world and they discover things that academics may formulate more formally later. But this is the wild, wild west with all these mobile apps. So in fact, one can think of the platform as a market has actually made it so easy for all of these entrepreneurs to actually enter and try lots of different things. So in fact, there are a lot of people in this market who are trying to figure out what is the monetization strategy that I should be using? How should I be pricing things? Even some of these mobile apps are trying to create little markets themselves. And in that context, they're also taking advantage. So be aware there's no privacy on your mobile phone. They are collecting lots of information on you, right? And everyone wants to figure out how do we tap into this information to actually make something useful out of it. As Preston, we were talking earlier before, lots of companies have spent lots of money to collect lots of data, but it's not clear anyone knows how to use it. And so my contention now is that, in fact, probably when we think about who's actually going to discover the ways to implement and use this big data, I would place my bet more on the entrepreneurs than I might on the existing corporations, if only for the fact that a corporation actually has to deal with a lot of baggage. Great baggage. It's their organization. It's the people that work for them. It's the incentive structures that they have, which is, again, a part of market design. But they have to deal with what's existing and then figure out, OK, once I even figure out how to use this big data, how do I actually get my employees to change their behaviors, to use that big data in an effective way? That's really hard. Whereas when you think about all the entrepreneurs that are coming up, they can take that big data and they don't have any baggage. So they can very quickly figure out, OK, here's how you would implement this big data and create a product and sell that product and create an organizational culture around that new way of thinking about big data that I think is difficult for big organizations.
So the mobile app designers design themselves a game or whatever it might be that they're trying to sell to a little core niche audience, and they're trying to monetize that, and they're trying to make some money out of it, perhaps through advertising on the site or whatever. But they're actually sitting on something far more valuable, which they're not even perhaps trying to monetize. I mean, are they actually getting any money out of this data set that they've got that's sitting there on their app or coming through it?
It's starting. So I wouldn't say that anyone has hit it big. The things that we hear about are, of course, the gaming apps. Those are the ones that have made money so far. But for example, there's a company called Data, which is up in San Francisco, probably started less than 2 years ago and has ramped up very quickly. And what they do is their actual customers are other app developers. So you think about the gold rush in California. It wasn't the gold miners who actually made all the money. It was Levi's who made the jeans, and it was Wells Fargo who did the banking for all of those miners. So what Data does is it says, OK, we're a service company to these mobile app developers. What they do is put a little bit of code in that app, and every time someone opens up that app, they can track their location, their time, and a limited set of information about what other apps are running at the same time. And from this, they combine it with all the other data we have on maps, on traffic, on where people are, what locations they're at, on events such as concerts, and they can figure out very detailed profiles about consumer behaviors. So at the first level, they're just helping the app developer understand their own customer. But then you can think, OK, well, they can actually take all of their clients, aggregate that data, and now they have some information about the whole community that exists in a certain area, right? And that's where the big money may lie, in aggregating this data.
We will take questions, as usual. So please step forward if you have specific questions. Preston, I want to bring you in on that. So you raised this idea of the potential of the data and how we're going to use it. And obviously, as we all know from big data, it's full of blind alleys, right? I mean, what are the challenges you're facing specifically in the processing of that and the understanding of that and the way to mobilize that? I mean, it's like presumably the rival valuations of current data versus older data versus data that's a year old and so on. I mean, all of these things have to be kind of triaged, right? They have to be kind of valued in themselves.
So that's a great question, which unfortunately has kind of a complicated answer.
Yeah.
So some data, actually data on your web browsing, I'm going to divide into 3 chunks. One chunk is things that you're interested in right now. You might be shopping for ski poles or something, and that will vanish. The value of that will go away very rapidly. If you just look at overall depreciation of web browsing data, that is to say, how much is data that's a week old worth in terms of predicting what will you buy, it goes away at something on the order of 1% to 4% per day. It disappears very rapidly. On the other hand, if you investigate ski resorts every fall, having years of data is quite valuable because it allows me to say not just what to show you, but when to show you. And I can't do that if I don't have a long enough data series to actually see that pattern emerge. And then finally, there's some where your interest never fades. For me, that's PCs, but that you see me constantly looking at this over and over again. So there are really kind of 3 very different buckets about how transitory and how valuable the data is. One thing I wanted to say to Pai-Ling's remarks is that something on the order of half of all monetization of free games is showing ads for other free games. So it's really unclear how this actually eventually makes money, because actually I'm reminded of a thing that Stephen Wright said, which is a hummingbird eats its body weight every day. How does it know when to stop? It eats another hummingbird. And actually this issue of how do I depreciate data and how do I value data in a world in which some data becomes valueless really fast and other data is only valuable if you reach critical scale. This is it's a very complex problem, and it's one that the market is not well positioned yet to solve, although I think it is probably going to be entrepreneurs who figure out how to solve that in some collective way.
So in a sense, it does, going back to flows, it does need to start, I mean, like with the ski example, every fall you're going to book a holiday, you need to start spotting those flows on that kind of temporal chart of human patterns, which perhaps they are identifiable in human behavior. I don't know how temporal I am in my shopping habits, but obviously, I, like most human beings, I'm pretty stupid and unaware about how.
I actually think we are much simpler than we expect from the inside. So that is to say, looking at this is the opinion of many psychologists, is that people are actually very simple, but it doesn't feel simple on the inside. It's much easier to understand other people. The rest of you are simple, I'm not. But in fact, we're actually much simpler and more predictable. And we're just now reaching the computational power to allow us to uncover those patterns and to see those. I actually wanted to pivot one more thing about apps, is that a market design question, when Apple launched its quite fantastically innovative app store, it didn't realize it faced a market design problem. And as a result, it just sold the apps. And what happens when you sell apps relative to renting apps is so I have a weather app on my phone. I compare the value of my weather app to, is it worth paying for a new weather app? It has to be enough better than my existing app. On the other hand, had I rented that app, at some point I would come due to pay again for the weather app. I would now say, what's the best weather app out there? If you rent, it promotes quality. If you sell, it promotes speed to market. So if you want to grow the app store really fast and have reach 1 million apps really fast, sell them and you'll have 1 million fart apps. And there are 262 fart apps in the Android Google Play Store. That last one, the 262nd, really important. if you rent them, what you get is a relatively small number of really good apps. In some sense, from a social perspective, it's much better to rent them. And probably, had they thought of it as a market design problem, that's what they might have done. Now with games, since you get bored with games pretty quickly, whether you buy it or rent it doesn't matter, because you're always getting, you know, the new Angry Birds or what have you. But that's an example of market design failure that could have been successful using the principles Michael talked about.
So a quick question.
This is a fantastic discussion. Thanks so much. So what you said one thing, Preston, that I really liked, the incredible value of ground truth. In statistical machine learning, something we always struggle with, right, in big data applications. We never have enough ground truth. Sometimes we have none. And we end up doing strange sort of clustery things where very tricky. One thing that we're starting to see change, at least in my world, which is biology, instead of having one thing that we want to predict, will someone buy this app, you know, a one-dimensional response variable for which we need ground truth, that's starting to transition, and we have these extremely high-dimensional objects, and we want to understand the relationship not between a big matrix X of predictors and a vector Y of responses, but the relationship between a big matrix X and a big matrix Y. And now this really starts to blur the relationship between supervised and unsupervised learning. And I just wanted to hear if anyone up there had any thoughts on that, on how we're going to transition from having one-dimensional responses to extremely complex responses. Because I think this bears on the App Store example too, for instance. You know, especially if you're designing a combined marketing schema, you want to start to understand complex behaviors rather than one-dimensional behaviors.
So that's a really great point. And in the advertising world, which I guess all of us have spent some time in, we're generally predicting a very large vector of things. You might buy lots of different things. You might click on lots of different ads. The set of left-hand side variables is extremely large. So if I have 200,000 ads to choose from, I'm trying to say, will you click on any of those 200,000 ads? And I'm trying to predict the click rates of all 200,000. The remark I want to make on that is, as you increase the number of those things, the set of things that can go wrong grows with it. And even if it grows linearly, it just gets big. In the advertising world, the odds that I've got a spurious prediction as the one that I choose, if I'm only going to choose one of the ads, gets really large as the number of potential ads gets large. It just becomes more likely that I believe this ad's going to get a click. I'm going to learn if I run it a few times that it doesn't. And so I get a lot more spurious prediction. What we're missing in machine learning, and in fact, if you use any of the three major services, Siri, Google Now, or Cortana, you experience this all the time, is the service can suggest something to you, but it also has the option of being silent. None of them are silent enough. If it doesn't know, it shouldn't say anything. The problem that they've solved is, which is the thing that ranks highest? But that's not really what I want. I want, is it relevant? The fact that it ranks highest, if I'm 0.01% likely to be interested in it, that may be the best thing, but that's just because none of them are any good. Silence ought to get more weight in this. I won't name the service, but one kept telling me, you are 2,652 miles from the Cracker Barrel. I didn't even know, like, what? So this spurious correlations, and I don't know, there's a Tyler Vegan has this wonderful site that everybody should go look at, because I'm going to predict a bunch of crazy things with movie data. And so this is murders by steam, hot vapors, and other gases is almost perfectly correlated with the number of films that Nicolas Cage made that year. And the thing is, if I have enough right-hand side variables, I can predict anything. And if it's how many movies somebody made, if I have all of the actors, I can predict anything. Now, of course, it's going to break as soon as I take one more year, but I've got more actors. And so this problem of spurious correlation gets big the bigger the data gets. And that's something that we have not really prepared ourselves as for all the failures of machine learning that are in our future.
Brett.
So let me just,
Sorry, yeah,
can
but
I
one-
just
sorry,
add
Karen.
one more thing on that.
Sure,
I think that when you're dealing with complexity, the other thing that we as economists really think is valuable is having competition. So, you know, having one algorithm that tries to do everything is probably not the way things are going to, you know, we're going to converge on the right solution. It's going to be having several algorithms trying different things and having them compete and figure out which is the right answer.
It seems like blockchain technology has more promise dealing with market design questions than currency replacement, things like Ethereum and how NASDAQ is deploying blockchain. How do you think about that and the possibility of smart contracts and programming languages that use smart contracts changing how market design happens?
So I'll take a first stab at that, or I'll let someone else take a first stab. I actually work on this. We completely believe Bill Janeway's remark that the really important thing is this distributed ledger. And where the rubber really hits the road is I can give you access to some piece of information, I can give Ed access to a different piece of information, and I can do this in a really nuanced way, and in a way that you can see that I gave Ed access to that information without seeing the information. That's a brilliant piece of technology that we think has lots of applications where, for example, in the medical sphere, companies want to share records, but they're not allowed to actually show individual data to each other. And so, but for research purposes, we really want to aggregate all the data, just for the research purposes. So here we can verify that we're actually showing the relevant data and that we're not showing the part we're not supposed to show, so that the regulators can sign off that this is a valid technique. That I agree with. I also think, I disagree with one thing that Bill said, which is I haven't sold my Bitcoin. I bought Bitcoin in 2011, single best investment I ever made in my whole career. I haven't sold them yet because the drug use, that is the illegal transactions use of Bitcoin, doesn't go away. It doesn't, the problem with Bitcoin isn't the ledger or its application of blockchain. It's that the average cost of a transaction is about $5. When I bought coffee in Seoul, Korea with a Bitcoin, I paid $4 for the coffee, but there was $5 worth of computation that went on in the background to verify that my transaction was legitimate. That's the thing. The MasterCard is the cheaper technology. That's the problem with Bitcoin. Now let me, someone else wants to.
Michael, do you have anything to say?
Oh, I thought
He's just said
Preston
it
gave
so
a great
perfectly,
answer, so-
Preston, that you have nothing to add. Pai-Ling?
Yes, the answer to the question.
Yes, Brett. That's all you need to know. Hi.
Hi, I would be interested in the topic about data security and protection of data. We didn't cover that at all, and we know that every year we are creating more and more data. It's exploding. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, how does this impinge on, I mean, obviously you're looking at it from the company's point of view. How does this impinge on the consumer? Pai-Ling, maybe you'd start with.
Yeah, this is the big issue that's going to hit us very soon. Like I said, there's all this data. No one knows how to use it. So that's great for security because no one knows how to use it, actually. So there's no problem yet. I would say that as typically has happened with new technologies, if you think about security, at least from a government policy role, the government is always behind on these things. And I think there's a good reason for that. But it's a difficult challenge that the US is not really addressing right now. I think Europe is ahead in terms of thinking about the privacy issues. So, you know, as an economist, I have my faith in the markets, and I'm hoping someone comes up with something. But that said, it's, I don't have an answer for you yet. It is going to be an issue, and there will be money to be had by someone who can actually solve it.
So I have a couple of things to add to that. One is Sony was sort of wrecked by the hack. I mean, if you look at the damage that was done to Sony, I actually think the markets have underestimated just how bad that damage is. On an ongoing basis, Sony has now revealed how it did business. It's pissed off lots of actors because it was, you know, had all these catty remarks about the actors that were secret. This was a devastating hack on Sony. What's happened with the U.S. firms, with Home Depot and Target and so on, with the credit card releases, they haven't been punished very much. But I actually think a lot of CTOs, CIOs really have their heads in the sand about just how serious this problem is, and Sony is the poster child. Sony should say everybody should get more secure. Now let me talk a little bit about modern security. Most companies are still using perimeter defenses. So we're just going to try to keep the bad guys out of our company. The correct thing to do is actually interior defenses. If I've never asked for my CEO's files, and I come along and ask for those files, that ought to get escalated up. I may have to do 5-factor authentication to get access to files that I'm legitimately allowed to see, but I've never accessed before. On the other hand, if this is a SharePoint site I've been to every day for the last 2.5 years, I may not even need a password if I'm at the same IP address. If all of a sudden I show up in Romania, okay, that's a 3-factor authentication.
Okay, so I mean, that's firewalls. Mike, is there anything to add about protection and the misapplication of data and how, I guess, you guys need to be sort of, need to be policed?
Right, so I mean, there's no question that guarding the data is extraordinarily important for customers, for user trust, for everything else. And I feel very, very blessed that as a market designer, I don't have to think about it because other people do.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. I realize we're now a minute over, and I'm sorry for that. But thank you for listening.